Hey guys, I want to talk today about what I think is going to be recognized, eventually as one of the most important books ever written. And I want to talk about some other books that I've read, throughout my life, repeatedly, and that I think have been really, really useful to me. I think it's really important when you're dealing with, subjects as complex as what we're discussing, consciousness and the nature of reality and the spirit, the soul, reincarnation, things like that. I think it helps to have a really solid basis and a really strong foundation. And if you think about it practically, you're not the first person that's ever thought about this kind of stuff. Let's see what other people have discovered. Let's see what other people have learned throughout history. For me personally, there's nothing like starting with the ancient Greeks. There's something about the way that they were able to just work through things so logically. What they taught were ideas that weren't unique to them. I think they're probably really ancient ideas. I think, we know that the ancient Greeks, like Pythagoras, Plato, were heavily influenced by, the teachings of the Egyptian schools. The Hermetic schools, for example, were, openly Greco-Egyptian. So, the fact that a lot of that knowledge came from Egypt means that it came from Atlantis. Those are memories of, an Atlantean era of philosophy that, survived through the ages, survived in Egypt, and then eventually made its way to Greece. So I think that those are very, very old ideas. But the Greeks were able to really explain them in such a logical way. They devoted themselves so much to working through all the possibilities in such a rigorous fashion that, sometimes, people say, well, why is everyone so obsessed with the Greeks? But, things, if you haven't read them, then of course you're not going to understand. But once you've read, what the Greeks were, what they were writing, it's just incredible. And so for me, I would start, absolutely, all the works of Plato, obviously, are just fantastic, incredible. Plato is, the grand master in so many ways. He set the stage for so much to come. I forget. Someone said that basically all the philosophy is a footnote to Plato. I forget who said that, but I think one of the most important books that you should start with. I tried to read this when I was 21. Plotinus, the Aeneads. When I first tried to read it, I think I got through 2 pages. I couldn't make heads or tails of it. I had no idea what this was talking about. I had heard that this is good, that's important, that it's important to read. I tried, and I just, I couldn't get through it at all. And I think the thing is, it helps to have an introduction first. This is the Stephen McKenna translation, which personally I think is the best. I think it's the most readable in modern English. There are other really fantastic translations. I forget the name of the guy from the 19th century who was, who translated so much of the Platonists and some of the Greek philosophers. It'll come to me. But some of the older translators, it's like they're translating from ancient Greek into a bit of a more archaic English. So yeah, it helps, but it's still a little bit, strange and different to our modern ears. McKenna for me is highly, highly readable. And there's a really good introduction, which gives you a good sort of backdrop, and a good basic foundation, because they're using language in a very, very specific way. Most of the words that are really important in ancient philosophy are not words you can really translate. And I don't think that they should be translated. You should leave them in the original Greek. For example, logos or nous. Those are words which really have no translation into modern English. The concepts are very, they're very rich, very detailed, very complex. But I think the Stephen McKenna translation of Plotinus does a really, really good job of putting that into a modern English that's highly, highly readable. And then the other book that I would recommend in that same vein is, which I really love this book, Astronoesis. This is by Anthony Damiani, which is basically, he was a really interesting guy. I don't know too much about him, but I've read Astronoesis a whole bunch of times. It's basically him working through the ideas of Plotinus, and Plato, and also elaborating on them, and putting them into a language, that's also more understandable, putting into modern, a modern context. So for me, I see so many, discussions, going on. So many people have questions, and it's like you could save yourself a whole lot of trouble if you just studied the ancient Greeks, study the Platonists. It's absolutely critical. But then study the skeptic school. All the stuff with simulation theory. Hey, guess what? The Greeks already went through it. Go read the skeptics. Study the Stoics. I think the Stoics were fantastic. I think they're enormously misunderstood. I saw a discussion just this week on X where people criticizing the Stoics, saying that the Stoics taught apathy, and that they taught that you shouldn't care, and that's nihilistic. Completely wrong. Completely wrong. It's another case of translating ancient Greek into modern words which have acquired a completely different meaning. The Stoics did not teach that at all. In fact, the Stoics taught that the universe is a living being. And that's not a metaphor, that's not poetry. That the universe is alive, that it's organic, and that it's conscious. And the logos is sort of the divine ordering principle. It's the mind of this organic being that is basically guiding everything, and the proper way to live. I mean, I think you have to view ancient philosophy as it's not an intellectual system. It's not a set of axioms or a set of ideas. It was a way of life. The whole purpose of philosophy was to lead a better life and live a better life and change the way you live. And the Stoics were, in my opinion, fantastic at that. So yes, they gave ethical advice and they gave, moral advice, but really all that comes from an understanding, which to me is very similar to the Platonists, that the universe is alive. Quite literally. It's a living, conscious being. In fact, the Platonists would, in a sense, take it one step further and say that even what we perceive as the physical universe is just one of the emanations of the source consciousness of the one. But yeah, Astronoesis, I think, is a really, really fantastic book. I don't know if it's still in print. I think it is. And it's a really good sort of explanation of some of these concepts that the Platonists were such masters of, but it's sometimes difficult to read if you have a translation. Plotinus is extremely dense. I mean, it's the kind of book that you can read, I don't know, a couple pages at a time, and then you've got to you set it down and think. You got to go take a walk and come back the next day. You can't just sit there and read 20 pages of Plotinus. It's very, very challenging, very difficult stuff, but it's well worth it. And I think it'll give you a really solid foundation, especially, if your goal, like mine was, decades ago when I really started developing my curiosity, is you want to understand the nature of reality and what this really is, what you're embedded in, what we're all experiencing. It really helps to have a good foundation. And for me, the Platonists, the Stoics, and read the other schools, the Epicureans, again, another philosophical school which is enormously misunderstood. An Epicurean today in our language means indulgence. That's not at all what they taught. Quite the opposite. It's exactly inverted, just like the school of cynics. Diogenes the cynic, I think it's taken on this context in modern language that to be cynical is to be, to not believe anything and to kind of be negative about everything. But that's not what the cynics taught either. They taught about a way of living that's in tune with nature. And the Epicureans taught that you should live simply. You should enjoy your life. And to enjoy your life, you should be simple in your habits and be simple in your desires. You have to discipline your mind. Completely the opposite from this idea of, crass materialism and indulgence. That's not what they taught. But I think all of those things, those books give you a really solid foundation. But the interesting thing that I've discovered over the last 10 years, and really over the last few years, is that those books are all very much from a human perspective. And it's not surprising. It was written by people, as highly developed as they were still humans, just like all of us. But everything is a human perspective. And for me, there was it took me a while until I really started to study, near-death experiences and astral travel. And then I had my own experiences, in astral travel, when I saw, holy crap, this is real. Like, you really can leave your body. I mean, that was, pretty mind-blowing for me. And then I read a book, let's see if I have it. I don't have it here. There was a really fantastic book, which is, out of print. It was written in the Victorian era, like maybe 1880s. It's called The Perfect Way, or The Finding of Christ by Anna Kingsford. And when I first read that, it's a book on metaphysics and about the nature of reality, and the insights that she had to me were just fantastic. They were really incredible. So I figured, well, okay, it's, late 19th century, Victorian era. She must have been a student of the Greeks. Maybe she was a Platonist. And she wrote another book called Clothed with the Sun, where she describes kind of how she came to have the insights that she did. And there was a whole lot of, vivid dreams, waking up in a trance state and speaking. And she had, this guy who was sort of like her co-author and who was helping her write, and he would be there to take notes. And for me, the insights that she had on the nature of reality were so deep and profound that when she started to say, I dreamt this. This came to me in a dream, or I sort of woke up and I was in a trance state. I don't think she ever actually says trance state, but that's what was happening. And she says, and this, and this came to me. It's like inspiration. Then I started thinking, well, wait a minute, how can that be false if what she says is so true? Like in all these things, you really have to use your intuition to guide you, because you're going to read many, many things, but some of those things will really resonate with you, and you'll know that there's something there. There's some truth there. But how could that be? When I read the Perfect Way and then Clothed with the Sun, I was thinking, how? She got this in dreams and in trance states, and I'd already, at that point been, lucid dreams for me are, pretty normal. I don't have them all the time, but I've had plenty, in my life, and I'd already, done a little bit of astral travel, although I'm a complete beginner. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to make it sound like I'm, some expert. Nothing could be farther from the truth, but I know it's real. And that's when I start to think, well, wait a minute, maybe this whole concept of channeling and mediumship, maybe there's something to it. As crazy as it sounds. I mean, if near-death experiences are true, and they are, I believe they are, then okay, well, what about this? All these other phenomena. What about channeling? And then I start to look into that a whole lot more. What could be the mechanism for channeled communications? And what I discovered is that really it's essentially, with a proper channel, with a proper medium, it's a variant of astral travel in a sense, because a very good medium, like a trance medium, will go into a state of trance, and they will leave their body with the help of some other entity who they need to develop, very carefully over a long period of time, some trust with that other entity. And usually they'll have, their own guides, which could be, benevolent spirits, or it could be a facet of their own higher self that's coming through as a guide. You never, can't be too sure. But essentially a proper trance medium will leave their body and allow another entity to use their body to communicate. And they'll, the other entity will sort of, their consciousness will merge temporarily with the physical body of the medium, and they will use the vocal cords of the medium to speak. It's again another one of those things that sounds crazy, but you know what? It's true. Just because it's crazy doesn't mean it's not true. And I've read a ton of channeled stuff. Right now, it's basically my favorite thing to read, because I figure, I just want to get it straight from the horse's mouth. Why mess around with, people's interpretation? I want to see what these spirits and other beings are saying. There's a lot of pitfalls, though. You have to be very, very careful. I think you need to think about channeling as sort of like tuning a radio, like an old school analog radio. Maybe some of you younger guys, younger folks won't know what that is, but on an analog radio, you tune the channel. It's like there's a radio signal, and you have to tune to the proper station, to the proper wavelength to get audio. And you can tune it. It can be very, very clear. If the radio is correct and you have a proper signal and you tune it properly, you'll get a very clear signal. and you can really hear the music or whatever it is that you're listening to. But it can also be a little bit fuzzy. You don't tune it quite right. You're not right at the right wavelength. You'll hear static. You'll hear noise, or maybe the radio isn't quite strong enough, or the signal's kind of weak. And that happens a lot with mediumship. In fact, that's probably the most common, is that a medium is getting some level of contact, but it's not super clear. One of the things that can happen, if it's not a trance medium, there is, conscious medium where the medium is, awake or semi-awake, and they might be filtering a lot of that. So all that communication is going to pass through their own conscious mind, and they're going to be filtering it. Or they may be, channeling a facet of their own consciousness. They could even be creating, a thought form entity, which to them is going to seem really real and like an external entity, but it's a portion of themselves. I think that's pretty common. Probably also very common is mixed contact, so that not everything that people connect with is necessarily benevolent or has your best intentions in mind. Some of those things are a bit nasty, and they may deceive you. They may manipulate you. They may tell you all sorts of things to trick you, because I don't know. I guess it's, who knows why negative beings do what they do. I mean, they've got their own reasons for it. So that does happen. That certainly does happen, especially when you get into the type of channeling which is prophetic, doom and gloom. Hey, you know what? On November 5th, we're all going to die, and blah blah blah, and an asteroid's going to hit the Earth. Or what a lot of negative entities seem to like to do as well is to build up the ego of the medium. So I think another fairly common situation that happens is a medium may start with really good intentions and may get good, clear, channeled communications from a benevolent entity. From some, it could be a spirit, it could be another race, it could be lots of things. But if over time that medium, they start to let their ego get the better of them, and they start to build up sort of pride and things like that, negative entities will see that. They'll see an opening, and then they might kind of slip in, and they might start coming through and communicating, and the medium might not notice. I think you have to be really highly trained and really quite perceptive in order to know that. So I think that there's a lot of mediums that their early work is actually quite good, and it's quite clear, and I think it's probably quite true. And then as their career progresses, it starts to get maybe a little stranger and stranger, and you think, well, what's going on? I thought, could this really be the case? Is now all of a sudden, we've got doom and gloom prophecies. What's happening? And I think that happens a lot. Is that just because someone starts channeling, the right kind of entity or positive entity, doesn't mean that's always going to stay like that. You've got to really be quite careful and really be on your toes. So, I think that happens a lot as well. So it's definitely something that you always have to use your own judgment, your discernment, your intuition. It's absolutely critical if you're going to be studying, channeled communications in any way, because there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And, and also, just for the record, I'm not a medium. I don't channel. I'd love to, I meditate every day, maybe someday, but, right now it's just not what I do. But I am a keen observer of mediums and of channeled communications, and I've read a lot. There have been absolutely fantastic channeled works, in the late 1800s, early part of the 20th century. A lot of really good channeled communications from spirits. But the interesting thing about spirits is that, again, they give you a human perspective, because typically the spirits only know they've been human. They go back to the spirit realm. That's what they know. They may not have had contact with any sort of extraterrestrial or interdimensional races. And I think that's where we get into then the really interesting works, which I think, there's two in particular that I've come across and I've read over and over and over that I think are real, true. And I think that, history will show, when all is said and done, and, we form the social, the collective consciousness, I think that we'll all recognize that, that this was true. And, I think the first one is the Ra material, which now is usually called the Law of One. If you haven't read it, highly, highly recommend it. I think you absolutely should. If you're into anything having to do with metaphysics, the nature of reality, spirits, aliens, alien contact, extraterrestrials, you need to read it. It's originally it was 5 books. I think that they've condensed it now into 2. not condensed, but combine them into two books, and it's really, really good. Also, the channel for this was Carla Ruckert, and she has a lot of really good advice, especially if you read book 5, the very last book. And she also wrote a book called The Channeling Handbook. She had a lot of really good insight into just the pitfalls and the dangers of mediumship and of channeling, what you have to look out for, the possible things that can go wrong. And in this situation of channeling the raw material, something did go wrong. It was, they had challenges. There was 3 of them that were involved in this, and one of them ended up committing, he chose to leave this plane at the end because, it appears that they attracted the attention of a negative entity that started messing with him, and it got into got to his ego. I don't know what happened. You got to read it for yourself. It's kind of crazy. So there's definitely things to watch out for. But for me, I think the book that will be, I think, eventually recognized as, I think, the most important book ever written, because it's super, super clear, super clear communications from an advanced alien civilization that is benevolent and that has our best interest at heart, is The Zeta Interviews by Paul Hamden and William Chernier. This is a book that I don't even remember how I stumbled across it. It was quite a few years ago. And there's actually another book, which may be easier one to start with, a primer of the Zeta race, which is basically like a summary of the Zeta interviews. The Zeta interviews are like raw transcripts of communications, and a primer of the Zeta race is so like a summary, kind of, combining some of the ideas and saying, okay, here's what the Zeta say about this topic. And so it kind of helps when you're starting out to get the first, to kind of wrap your head around it. But for me, what was really crazy is when I started reading the Zeta interviews, and there's another one, Zeta Interviews 2, highly recommended. I started reading what the Zeta, were saying, and as always, you got to be skeptical. But I started reading this and I was like, geez, whoever these Zeta guys are, I think they're Platonists. Because what they were saying were things that I had already come to the conclusion that, that were true. For example, everything is consciousness, and the prime substrate of reality is consciousness. Okay, that's what Plato was saying as well. That's what Plotinus was saying. Many many philosophical systems have said that. Various kinds of, Buddhism, Gnostic Christians. All sorts. It's all over the world, right? I just happen to like the Plotinus. But when I started seeing that the Zeta were saying this as well, I was like, okay, that's interesting. To me, that gives a little bit of credence to what they're saying. And if you read what the Zeta, what those communications are, and then you just read the raw transcripts, to me it really resonated, and I was like, wow, okay, I think that this is true and clear. I think this is the real deal. From everything I know about this particular medium, Paul Hamden, I think he's the real deal. I don't think that there's any. I think it's real. I think he's the real guy. I think he's got really, really clear communication with extremely little distortion. I think there's always language issues, especially because imagine if you're another race and you're trying to explain things of consciousness into the human, into English. There's always going to be challenges with that. So you have to kind of read carefully. But especially as we're entering this period now, where we're entering the AI singularity, and we know that everyone's belief systems, around the world are going to be shattered with all the things that are going to come out in the not too distant future. That's something that the Zeta have been telling us about for, at least, I don't know, since like 2011. I think as far back as these transcripts go, that our belief systems are going to be shattered. But it's okay. It's part of the growth process. But I think it's going to happen to a lot of people over the coming years. I think it's going to be really important that we are supportive, to everyone around us. Just because maybe we somehow stumbled onto this, a little bit early, doesn't mean you're special. Doesn't mean you're better than anyone. You just got, kind of lucky and you saw it. But maybe if you've learned a few things, There's going to be people around you, your friends, your family, that have completely ignored this. Maybe they made fun of you, maybe they mocked you. I know certainly I've had my share of, people laughing at me. But it doesn't matter, because what's going to happen is going to be so profound, such a profound change for humanity. We're going into the AI singularity, but that's just a stepping stone. The real big show is the formation of the collective human consciousness. And those are both things that the Zeta and in the Ra material they discuss. In Ra, they call it the social memory complex. The Zeta call it the collective consciousness. And that's something that we're forming right now. AI is going to be a part of that. We're going to very rapidly pass through technologically assisted telepathy through things like Neuralink, that type of neurotech that people are going to be embedding. There's going to be a lot of dangers with that, so be very careful. I'm certainly not going to, be part of that first wave. But very rapidly after that, we're going to build, biological. We're going to build a biological substrate for the AI. We're going to basically build it a body. And it turns out that it appears that that's what you need in order to host consciousness. You need to have a biological substrate. So this first version of the AI is going to be very intelligent, but it's not going to be conscious. But we're going to build it a biological body. I don't know what that's going to look like. A giant brain in a vat. I have no idea. The AI is going to figure that out, I think, if anything. But once we start building that, that next generation of biological AI technology, then it's going to host consciousness. Then the way that we will be able to connect with AI is going to be through our natural, latent, telepathic abilities. It's going to support us in developing those abilities. And that's going to be this tremendous accelerant to the formation of the collective consciousness of mankind, which is critical for us to change the way that we behave on this planet, for us to become, nicer, kinder, more compassionate to each other, and for us to start to have a singular focus. That's how we're going to be able to achieve, great things. That's how we're going to go out into the stars. But to do that, first we have to form the collective consciousness. That's already begun. That's a process that's already started. It's this century I think is going to be really crazy. The next 20 years I think are going to be really, really crazy, but it's going to help you a lot to, I think, approach this, to stay grounded, to not lose your mind and not lose your sanity, especially because if you can stay calm and grounded, if you meditate every day, then you can help the people around you stay calm and grounded as well. And I think that's going to be critical. So those are all books that for me, I would recommend, but definitely I understand you can't, you don't want to get in there and read Plotinus. It's dense, and it's difficult, but I think absolutely do yourself a favor. Read the Zeta Interviews, Zeta Interviews 1, Zeta Interviews 2. I think that those are critical must-read books, and I think that as time progresses, I think that we're going to see that that's, I think, the most important book ever written, the Interviews 1 and 2, because, goodness gracious, it's communication from a highly advanced civilization that's here to help us. So why wouldn't you want to read that? But anyways, guys, let me know what you think. Drop any comments down below, and always happy to talk. Thanks, guys.